Welcome to the Health Coach Nation podcast. My name is Hailey Rowe, and I'm a sales and marketing coach and LinkedIn lead generation service provider. I work with health, life, and mindset coaches and online service-based business owners to help them get more sales, shift their time to the client-generating activities instead of just the busy work, and overcome that social media overwhelm. Let's get into the show. If you're ready to take on your next paying clients, I have good news. My free 4 Basics of Client Attraction and How to Stand Out class is live at haileyrowe.com/client-attraction. In the class, you're going to learn the top 2 traits I recommend for most coaches and entrepreneurs if they really want to turn this into a career. You're going to learn how you can build demand for your services and stop getting crickets on your posts. You're going to learn the sales roadmap I used to improve my sales conversion rate and help my clients do the same. And you're going to learn so much more. So go to haileyrowe.com/client-attraction and get your copy of the class today. Being a podcast guest and all the common myths that we need to bust about that process and using that as a marketing strategy. So first, I'll have you introduce yourself, and I do not want to mispronounce your name. So please share your name as well as how you got into the podcasting world and what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today, Hailey. And yep, I have a pretty complicated name. It's easy to say, Sam Brake Gear, so like 2 car parts. However, brake is spelled B-R-A-K-E and then G-U-I-A for the gear, so it is complicated. But I am the co-founder of PodWritten. It's a podcast booking agency for health and wellness businesses. We help them get booked on podcasts as guests. It's a business that I run alongside my wife, Gozde Gaze. And yeah, we're super passionate about all things podcast guesting. I initially got into podcasting in 2018, where similar to Hailey's past, I was working at a startup. And it was environment very much where we were encouraged to just learn, fill in spaces, and just move fast and just figure things out. And one of the spaces that I fell into was podcasting. I really loved it. I ended up producing a couple podcasts for the company that picked up traction. And then I worked for a podcast booking agency alongside that company. I also helped them with a podcast, but I really got involved in the whole podcast booking process and pairing up right fit guests with podcast hosts. So I am someone that's worked on both sides. I've worked as a podcast producer and host. I currently am one. I host the show Mikes to Millions, which Hailey was on, and you can check out that episode. And then I also work as a podcast guest booking specialist. So I've got a pretty wide perspective when it comes to all sides of podcast guest booking.
Amazing. Well, one of the things that I hear from coaches and wellness professionals is like, I don't know if I'm ready to be a guest on podcast because XYZ, insert reason. My website's not completely finished. I don't have enough testimonials yet. I've never been on a podcast, so I'm worried. Oh, that person's audience might be too big for me. So what would you say to that I'm not ready yet kind of comment?
Yeah, so I would say that there's definitely always a good time to start your podcast guest booking journey. And I think people have this perspective of like when they start, they might get on a huge show and then it's just that's where they're going to enter podcast guesting from. But the truth is, it takes time. It's like any skill. I'm sure if they have experience in their job, they're going to know that like where they are now versus day one is quite different. And it's taken a long process to build up to where they are. So I would certainly say, wherever you are in your podcast journey, if you have that feeling of like, I'm not ready, there's definitely opportunities for you to guest on podcasts and improve your skill set as a guest. And that could start off with as simple as like going on shows which have a small number of ratings. So you can check out how big a show is. One of the best ways to do that is looking on Apple Podcasts. And you can usually see if a show has like ratings, like if it's got 5-10 ratings, it's a relatively small show. And you know what? You can reach out to the host and you could just put yourself forward as a guest. I'm happy to share a free resource that with Hailey, and then she can share it with the community. And that will include a podcast pitch template that you can use. Super simple, super basic. And just start off on small shows. And the best thing to do is just build up your confidence. And you might think that, you know what, I don't know what I can talk about. But the truth is you are offering value. If you're someone that's working in the health and wellness space, you have a unique perspective. No one's lived your life. No one's else is running your business. you have a unique perspective that you can talk about. And I'm happy to get into that further in this episode. But otherwise, there's definitely a space that you can get into. You can start off with small shows. And again, if you don't feel like you're ready to jump on podcasts just yet, you can still do Instagram lives or Facebook lives to build up your confidence. And then when you have that confidence, like I can articulate myself well, I know what I'm talking about, I know my topic, then you can pursue those smaller shows and then slowly scale upwards. So that's a quick like snapshot of like what I would say to someone that has some sort of fear or apprehensiveness towards guesting on shows.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And the other thing to keep in mind about podcasting is if you want to be efficient at marketing, one of the things that's a benefit is you're marketing to many at one time with one podcast. As you know, when you go live to your 5 followers on Instagram and you're new, that's not going to get a lot of traction, right? But if you're on a podcast that has X number of downloads and it's big, or it's bigger than you're following, that can help you start to grow. So one of the other things that you just mentioned, though, Sam, that I think is a good point is people feel like, oh, who would want to hear from me? Like, I don't have a unique, brand story to share yet or something like that. So how do you address that objection or concern of like, I don't know if I have anything really great to contribute?
Yeah, so I would say personally look at your backstory. What inspired you to get into this? Do you have some sort of story where perhaps you were suffering from some sort of medical or some sort of issue, and then you turned to look for alternative answers elsewhere, and then you discovered something that completely changed your life, and you realized that you could cure or reverse these issues that you're having, and then you went on to help other people? That might not seem too significant to you. Like, you might overlook that and think, well, I'm just doing my job, and maybe this backstory doesn't play like a huge role in who I am and what I'm doing. But the reality is that might actually really resonate with people. And we interpret the world through stories. Like, our brains remember and take in information through the lens of storytelling. So your story of how you arrived to where you are today is more impactful than you might imagine. And also it helps people relate to you and understand you better. So certainly first thing I would do is like look at your story, dissect it, understand like the key moments in your life which have led you to where you are and what makes you interesting in that sense. Also consider what topics you can speak about that maybe other people aren't speaking about. And a good way to do this is like, do you have an opinion that's maybe unpopular in your industry? And I wouldn't say just come up with something just for the sake of being heard, but you might have an idea where you're like, you know what? Most people in my industry think this. I actually disagree. That's a really good perspective to come from, because that's going to offer something new that maybe a host hasn't talked about or hasn't considered before. So those are just a couple ideas that I would suggest to start with.
Yeah. And I know for me, when I'm selecting guests for my podcast, when they have a unique topic that I'm like, ooh, we have not covered that before, or I know nothing about that, I'm always more prone to be like, yes, let's get this scheduled quick because I want to learn about this. And I'll give you an example of a controversial opinion, I guess. Recently on Instagram, I saw a functional wellness professional do a post about, are you a protein zealot or a protein enthusiast? And how she's saying everyone lately has been talking about how you should have like 1 gram of protein per like goal body weight or whatever every day. And how she was saying like the body doesn't, it may not need that much. And, every day you don't have to hit it and like, blah, blah, blah. Like she's having a more balanced approach. And it was a good topic because that is something you see, there's always like crazes in whatever field you're in, whether it's wellness or even in my field, business, like people can talk about the new changes with the algorithms or whatever. And so if you can have a contrary opinion or share a more balanced approach or something like that, that can always be a good thing to bring in, as you were saying. So what are some other challenges that, or myths, I guess you could say, or misconceptions that people have about being a podcast guest?
Yeah, so one of the major ones is this sense of like, oh, I don't have connections. And fair enough, like I'm not going to lie, connections do help. Like here at PodWritten, we are able to secure our clients more bookings because we have a strong network of health and wellness podcast hosts that we can like hit up, and they know that we deliver good guests, we deliver good pitches, and they're going to open our inbox or our messages when they arrive in their inbox. So it helps. Do not get me wrong. However, all of these connections that we secured through cold pitches. So at one point, we never had any contact. We sent over a pitch and they opened it up. They liked it. We got them a guess, and then it kind of just went from there. So I think it's really important to come into this perspective of thinking like, I might not have a network, or maybe you do have a network and it's small. Definitely use it. Like any connections you have, use them. But if you don't have those connections, it's okay, because what hosts are looking for more than anything is value. As long as you arrive in their inbox and you're delivering value and you're being polite and respectful, then that can really help you just get your foot in the door. And then once you have one booking with a show, then it really adds credibility to you and your story and your brand. And then when you pitch yourself again, you'll be like, hey, you can check out my interview on this show. And then that kind of like allows you to get more bookings. Then once you get more bookings, you can show off more podcast results. And by the time that you're sending someone a pitch and you've got like 3 examples of shows that you've been on that are like really high ranking shows, then it gets easier and easier from there. So I would say don't be discouraged if you don't have a network already. As long as you're sending valuable pitches that are going to be like right fit for hosts, then absolutely go for it. Another thing is like technical abilities. Some people are a bit put off thinking like, oh, do I need a really fancy setup that's going to cost me like hundreds of dollars? The truth is, you really only need like $100 for a decent microphone. And that's more or less it. As long as you turn up with good audio, and that's where the initial investment is going to be in a decent microphone, then you really don't need much else. And honestly, you don't need technical skills to navigate and understand how to use this equipment. I'm not a technical person, and Hailey, I don't know if you are, but I don't think as a podcaster that's a necessity.
Yeah, I've had a podcast since 2017, and I bought a mic and all the fancy things, and I don't use it because it actually is complicated and makes it sound, sometimes I think it sounds worse because I'm not setting it up right or something. But
yeah.
Anyways, we don't even use it. So
there you are. Yeah, exactly.
Best practice? Probably not. I am not going to say I am the best podcaster. I'm full out saying that because I repurpose lives as podcasts, and that's how it has to go for right now. But you bring up a very good point about that. And one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, because, 2 things came up for me when you were sharing getting started with being on podcasts. Mm-hmm. When you are on shows and referencing those shows, the more you can get other interviews. So I've noticed the same thing when it comes to having guests that I want to interview on my show. Mm-hmm. So like I had Amy Porterfield on the show, and I had Chalene Johnson recently, and Samantha Skelly, and all these kinds of people. And what I have found is don't make assumptions that someone doesn't want to be on your show. Try asking, because you may be surprised. Because when I start to reference those people, and when I take the risk and like personalize my pitch to someone I really want to talk to, it so far has always worked out. And it may be a long time to get them scheduled if they're a really busy, big name, but it has worked. So don't make assumptions is one thing that I want the audience to take away about. Like, if it's a bigger show that you're a little worried about, like, you may still be able to get on it. So don't just make assumptions that you shouldn't try. The other question I had for you is, how does somebody know if a show, like how many downloads a show has, or if a show is a good one to reach out to? Is there sites you use to like check, or, tell us more about that process?
Yeah, so it's still difficult to understand the number of downloads that a show actually has. Really, in theory, that's something that only the host is going to know. However, that is changing. There are changes which are making podcast downloads more transparent, assuming the host opt in. But the best way to assess the size and impact of a show is we like to use 2 methods specifically. Apple Podcast ratings. So you can go to check out a podcast in any region, and they are specific to region. So usually it's a good idea to check out the US, because if it's a US based show, for example, it's probably going to have a lot of its listenership there, and the US makes up the largest like English speaking podcasting market. So if you make sure that you check the US region for a show, you see how many ratings it has, and then you can get an understanding of how many people are listening to this show, and then how many people are going and leaving a comment or a review. It's kind of like Amazon, for example. Like, you're more likely to go for the product that has 1,000 ratings rather than one that has 50. So it's an indicator of trust, very much in the same sense that Amazon has trust with the comments that are left for a product. So that's one of the ways that you can check to see the impact of a show and kind of gauge its audience reach. Another way is listen notes. So that's a fantastic tool which can show you where a podcast stands within the world's like general ranking. So you can see if it's in the top 2% of shows, top 1% of shows. And I should add that while it might sound impressive if a show is in the top 5%, that's not too impressive when you take into consideration the fact that there's like over 5 million podcasts out there. A lot of them are inactive. A lot of them post fairly infrequently, and a lot of them have no listeners. So generally, we try, like here at PodWritten, we try and almost exclusively pitch shows which are like in the top 2.5% of shows. However, there are some exceptions to this. If you are someone with a very specific niche, then I would recommend you go after that niche, even almost the extent of like ignoring the size of the show. Because if you take it, for example, if you're like a health coach who focuses on helping African American women over 75 who are vegans, that's a super specific niche. So if you go on a really big show, then you're only trying to speak to like the tiniest percentage of that audience. Whereas if you find a show which only speaks to that audience, then 100% of the listeners are going to be perfect, your right fit clients. So that's why you really want to balance this idea of reach and specificity of like who you're going after, and take them both into consideration.
Yes, definitely. So with that, you were just saying how going off listen notes. I have to say, I'm very grateful to be on listen notes and be in the top 1.5%. I don't know how that happened, but I think you just brought up a good point that a lot of podcasters don't stay consistent, don't have their podcast for multiple years and that kind of thing. So I want to ask you about that in a second. But then the other thing you said was having a niche. So I have to say this too. I've been on podcasts and summits and things like that are big audience, but not totally my niche. Like it might have some of my niche, but then some others. And those surprisingly don't do as well as the ones that may be smaller, like you're saying, but are nailing my niche, like totally my people. So I can't recommend enough what you just said about, yes, reach out to bigger audiences so you can get more exposure, but also those small niche ones might be the ones that are the best use of your time. Okay, so going back to podcast stats, tell me more about this thing about, because I think do you know what the stats are about, like, how many people don't continue a podcast once they start, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so there's some mixed information about this. I think Buzzsprout has released information saying that like 80% of an episode gets consumed by like podcast listeners. I think that's a bit high to believe, but even 50% is understandable, because when it comes to podcasting, it's a really dedicated audience. Like, people really feel an affinity with the listener, with the host, and the audiences that are cultivated there, they're really strong, because podcasts, much like newsletters, are a relationship building platform. They are not so much like social media, which is more of a discovery platform. So you're more likely to be found on social media, certainly. But with podcasting and newsletters, you're more likely to build like a stronger community. I don't know. You might dispute that. I know that you're big on social media, and there are other people that are doing fantastic things with social media. I don't want to undermine the value of that. But certainly listeners, and I think it also plays into the fact that this is long form content where people are really invested in the topics, and also you're like literally in someone's ears, and it's often at times when they are giving their attention to something else. So they might be washing up, they might be commuting, they're doing things where they can easily consume this content. So it's not like social media where like if you just skip past the video, then you've got another one there. They're not like their attention isn't easily taken away by something else. They're very much like locked in. So I know that the consumption rate is something towards like 50 to 80% for like someone listening. I can say for example, for my show, like one quarter, so like 25% of our listeners finished like the entire episode. And it's something similar, like I would say like 75% get past like 50% of an episode. So like it really is, and these are 30 to 60-minute episodes. So the consumption rate is quite high, especially when you compare that to something like an Instagram reel on average is viewed for 3 seconds. So if you compare that with other forms of content, the consumption is incredibly high.
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the coolest things that I've done this year that I'm excited about is I added a private podcast for my clients. So just for them, because of the ease of consumption. It's so easy for them to have it on their phone and listen on the go if they need a quick hit of inspiration or marketing tip or things like that. So I've been like turning some of my videos from my programs into private podcasts for my clients. And it's fun also to look at the downloads and like, you know, which ones do the best, because it's good for me to know for my public content too about topics that resonate the most. And I'm curious, when you track that, like when you're saying I track that 25% of people listen to the whole podcast, are you using your podcast hosting system for that, like Anchor or whatever you have your podcast on, or what are you using? What are your tracking tools for that?
Yes. So unfortunately, I was using Chartable. Chartable is a great service, but it's being discontinued. Right now, it's October and it's going to be discontinued by December. So I wouldn't encourage anyone to sign up for that. But otherwise, there are other options. You can actually go into like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or the services. You can sign up to go specifically see within those podcast platforms how much your content is being consumed. They have individual statistics, so you can go into Apple, you can go into Spotify, and you can see their data, and they'll indicate like how much of your episodes are being consumed. But certainly, I hope that there are services to replace Chartable which do as good of a job as that. I'm currently looking to find them because I really love Chartable, and I'm very sad that it's going.
Yeah, I know of Chartable too, and that's kind of the only one that I know of, but I'm sure there's other services out there. So if anybody knows, feel free to reach out to us and tell us. Okay, last question for you. Is there any big, huge missed opportunities that you see when health and wellness professionals or coaches are being on podcasts and or podcasting themselves?
Yeah, so this is something that we've talked about. Hailey's done a great job of this. Like, she came on my show and she was fantastic at like organically and naturally bringing up and promoting your services, your courses, your offerings. I think one issue that a lot of people have when they're on a show is finding that balance between being too promotional or not promotional enough. And by not promotional enough, I mean like giving lots of value, but forgetting to mention their course, forgetting to mention their services, forgetting to bring up examples of clients, success stories. And that's probably the bigger issue that we see. So I definitely think that be conscious of the examples that you're giving. Make sure that you are giving good examples that showcase your abilities, your skill sets, client success stories. Make sure that you're telling stories as well, because stories will last in the memory of the listeners well beyond the episode is finished. And yeah, make sure that you're, of course, not being too overly promotional, but understanding when is a good time. If someone asks you a question and being like, hey, so yeah, last week I had a mastermind and someone asked me this, it's kind of good to drop in like, you got that mastermind, or like, I've got this free community event that someone turned up and they asked this. So it's kind of those subtle and natural kind of ways of dropping in what you're doing and how you're helping people and where you're active as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for this great advice. Where can people connect and find you after this episode?
Definitely. So Mike's to Millions, anywhere that you get your podcast, search that up, MIC. So Mike, as in that kind of Mike, not Michael. And Sam Break Gear, SAMBRAKEGUIA. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, and definitely reach out to me if you have any questions. You can also go to podwritten.com, pod and then written. And there's plenty of resources on there to help you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Fantastic. My pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this podcast. And if it's really helpful for you, I'd really appreciate if you share it and or leave a written podcast review. This tells the podcast sites that our show is useful and it will be promoted to more people that way. Thanks again.